exactly. I have my eye on him. Yes, that's Professor Kennedy, yes. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here with us at the Miller Center. And I think this is going to be a treat and engaging and interesting, both the film and the conversation that follows. We are excited this afternoon to screen American Creed and to have joining me in a conversation Professor David Kennedy of Stanford, and I'll do a more fulsome introduction when we have before our conversation, and also John Bridgeland, who was President George W. Bush's domestic policy advisor. But before we go forward, well, first of all, I should introduce myself. I'm Melody Barnes. I'm a professor of practice here at the Miller Center and also the co-director of the Democracy Initiative. Before we go to the film, since we are starting with film, I thought I'd actually kick off with a little bit of poetry. And how often do you get that at the Miller Center? And I want to start by reading just a few lines from a poem, Let America Be American Again, by Harlem Renaissance writer Langston Hughes. And he wrote, "Oh, let America be America again, the land that never has been yet, and yet must be. The land where every man is free, the land that's mine, the poor man's, Indians, Negroes, me, who made America, whose sweat and blood, whose faith and pain, whose hand at the foundry, whose plow in the rain, must bring back our mighty dream again. Oh yes, I say it plain, America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be." I read that because it is aspirational and it is angst-ridden. It is yearning and hoping for opportunity that hasn't been, but believing that it can come. Hughes wrote this poem in 1935, and during the period of the Great Depression, he was struggling professionally and personally, and at the same time, he was reflecting a tapestry of American experiences and dreams that crisscrossed race and ethnicity and class and religion and geography. 85 years later, that poem still strikes a chord among many in America right now. They have had their faith in the American dream shaken. They have questioned maybe, was the American dream ever for me? And I believe that what should we make of those questions when so many are wondering about our identity and our character and our creed? And those are the issues and the questions that Professor Kennedy and former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice raised in this film, American Creed. They engage, as you'll see, a number of Americans on this journey of asking and engaging and talking to them about their experience. So I hope that you will enjoy this film, watch it, listen to those stories, and then we'll have the opportunity to explore those questions together. First, and then all of
It's all about individual aspiration and achievement. Want to go It's part of our national myth. Indeed, no society can cohere over time if it doesn't possess some myths that people believe in common.
That's what holds us together. This great American creed that it doesn't matter where you came from, it matters where you're going. Bring ourselves around values, experiences, stories, if you will, about what it is to be an American.
Emerson Collective, GenStar Capital, Carnegie Corporation of New York, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, the Once Upon a Time Foundation, Todd Wagner Foundation, the Mackenzie Foundation of San Francisco, Nicholas Berggruen Charitable Foundation, Sandhill Foundation, and California Humanities.
I feel like my dad is definitely one of the strongest forces in my life that has been pushing me to educate myself and take school very seriously. He came to America from Poland without any money in his pocket and without knowing any English. So when I think about it, it like blows my mind. It's such a courageous thing.
David and I have been friends for a number of years on the Stanford faculty, and we found ourselves one day talking about America. As I would travel around the world, the one thing that always attracted people to the United States of America was this idea that it didn't matter where you came from, it mattered where you were going. You could come from humble circumstances, you could do great things. And David, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, found that it was this core of the essence of America that interested him too.
As you can see at a glance, Connie and I are two different people. We're not the same gender or the same race. We don't worship in the same church. We don't vote in the same political party.
Other than that.
But what we have in common is a shared sense of the fragility of our common purpose and common enterprise as a people. So that's what we hope we can discuss with all of you here this morning.
I hear more and more people say, we're coming apart. How we keep this tremendous narrative, this ideal going forward and contending with all of the new challenges that it's meeting. You have to understand what the common enterprise is. You have to understand what the common aspiration is. And I think we've lost sight of it.
My grandparents on both sides, when they came over from the old country, they all wanted to improve life for their children. But it was tough. My grandpa Klosik, died from black lung. He worked in the coal mines. My mom said he would be, spitting up black as he was on his deathbed. My grandpa Madden also began in the coal mines, and he established the plumbing business. And my dad and all my uncles became plumbers. Me growing up, I did not want to be a plumber, and my dad knew that. My dad would come home from work. He'd be black from working in a stoker, pulling out some ashes, whatever. Literally black. His hands would be black. You could see the whites of his eyes. He grabbed the glove and we'd go play catch. He knew how hard it was for my grandpa. He knew how hard it was for him and my uncles. He did not want it to be that hard for me.
It has been 107 years since the Cubs won the World Series.
The right manager can make all the difference. He's got the magic, he's popular with the players, and he likes to mix it up.
Well, hope always springs eternal in Wrigleyville.
It's all about building relationships. As you get to that point where everybody feels respect and trust, now we can really get somewhere.
Here's the 0-1. This is going to be a tough play. Play it. The Cubs win the World Series!
I think you have to be pretty self-confident. If you don't have good self-esteem, all kind of things intimidate you. Hazleton's been challenged in that regard, there's no question about it. The city itself, the structure itself has lost its confidence. You're a coal cracker, you're from northeastern Pennsylvania. That's just your identity. There's been no real economic boom around here since coal. Some days, I don't even recognize the place. There's no street lights. There's potholes everywhere, and all you hear about is all the tension in the city. Wow.
There's no need on the other.
Illegal immigration is destroying cities such as Hazleton.
Hazleton Mayor Louis Barletta is now defending the Illegal Immigration Relief Act passed by the City Council. The city ordinance would fine landlords who rent to illegals or employers who hire them.
Somebody say, oh, you Mexican, you have to live from here. But why about the discrimination? Because you white and we are brown?
This ordinance has never been about discrimination. This ordinance has been about checking with the federal government to see if a person is lawfully present in the United States.
It's standing up for American workers, for United States workers, and for taxpayers.
Everything's been magnified, and primarily the negative side was being magnified. There's so much misinformation going on here. You gotta quell the madness at some point. You gotta put your foot on its neck. The Hazleton Integration Project is trying to help bring together the cultures within our city, the Hispanic and Anglo cultures. We want to create a situation where the kids come together, whether it be academically, maybe a boxing class, take a yoga class, debate club, whatever. We want to create these baseball leagues. We want to get kids playing on the same teams, getting to know one another. You want to make kids friends fast? Put them on the same team with the same common goal. And I promise you, color of skin, language barriers, what you like to eat, that goes away just like that. Make them interact with one another, because I'll tell you what, the parents are going to follow, man. They got to come pick them up. They got to come watch them play. And then at some point, you got to start talking to one another. And I like them. I like this guy. I like this lady. I mean, they're good people. The moment we trust each other, at that point, we could build something. These people wanted to be in our hometown, and now it's their hometown, Hazleton. You have this group that wants to come in and raise families and go to church and attend schools and create jobs. And I really thought if we did not accept the group that was moving in, the city was going to die. And the thing that really baffles me, that I find kind of ironic, is the same group of people that are against our Hispanic brothers and sisters coming in had grandparents that came over from the old country to Hazleton at some point. And when they came over, they were made fun of. Their language, they didn't speak the language. They dressed funny. Their music was weird. What about that food? Their kids are dirty. All that same stuff was their grandparents had to endure those same thoughts.
We have to constantly remind ourselves that we are a country of immigrants. I hear some things that are said about immigrants. You know, people, they come here because they want to take advantage of the social welfare system. Really? The United States doesn't really have an extensive social welfare system. If you wanted to do that, you'd go someplace else, probably, not here. People don't come here because they want to be on welfare. No, they want to come here because they really do believe that they can make life better for themselves and for the next generation.
American national identity, from the earliest commentators on it, has been all about freedom and aspiration and clearing the ground for achievement and the fulfillment of dreams. And we're hesitant to blame any factors beyond ourselves for the failures that we inevitably encounter. There are instances in American history where that mindset, that psychology, actually is quite palpable. And in fact, what happened to my father in the 1930s is a prime example. My father grew up in a working-class Irish-American family. And he worked during World War I in an artillery shell factory in Buffalo, New York. This is a very well-paying job. So he saved a lot of money. So when the war was over in the early 1920s, he headed west to make his fortune. And eventually found his way to a startup mining operation in Washington State at a place called Trinity. There was a lot of promise that this place was going to be a major copper mining facility. But what intervened was the Great Depression of the 1930s. The mine went bankrupt and he lost everything. My father felt that he had let himself down, he'd let his friends and family down, who he'd encouraged to invest in this place. It broke his life in two, I think, that episode. His sisters later would tell me that as a young man, he was one of the sunniest, most energetic, upbeat people. He was not a sunny, upbeat person when I knew him. Now, at the height of the Great Depression, there were 13 million people unemployed in the United States, 25% of the workforce unemployed. And any reasonable observer might have said, hey, wait a minute, there was a systemic breakdown of some kind. The economy broke down. But the almost universal psychological response that men had to going unemployed was to feel guilty and ashamed and personally responsible for their situation. The promise of this society is not always fulfilled. And among the things we need to pay attention to is the gap between the promise and the reality, and why it is that some of our fellow citizens have not, cannot, do not, maybe will not ever realize what I will unapologetically call the promise of America.
Good morning. How are you? I hear that. We lost that hour of sleep. Good morning. Bye, baby. Bye. Good morning.
For me, what it means to be an American is that we get to enjoy freedom. But with freedom comes great responsibility.
It's cold.
I've been principal at Lindbergh now for 6 years. and I can't think of any place else I would rather be. The kids that we get to work with are wonderful, and I want to make sure that they feel loved and that we're giving them the best education they can give. So I'm living my American dream. That's to be an educator.
Hey, Gregory. How long are we gonna let this grow?
Until it stops growing.
Oh, forever then? Have a good day.
In the mornings, I think it's important that I'm visible, that the parents see me, and even if it's just a wave every morning, that's, just one step in building our community.
Today we are going to talk about the early Native American tribes in Oklahoma. We're going to make a map similar to the one that we made with our regions. Do you guys remember when we did that? Okay, we're going to make one similar to that, only it's going to be about the Native American tribes, the early ones. With your
Oklahoma is a land of Native Americans. I'm Creek Indian. This is located in Creek Nation, and so it's fun to get to see the Native Americans that come through the door. While we are a melting pot, we can't forget where we've come from, and we all need to learn about each other's history. The connection between my family history and where I'm at today is I'm a fifth-generation educator. My dad was a math teacher, and my grandmother was a teacher also. Even my great-great-grandfather, Modi Tiger was his name. He was also a teacher. So education, I guess, has always been in my blood. The message was that education is the key to success and to better yourself. But in the instance of my grandmother, her family also happened to have good luck. They were able to at least maintain some land in Indian Territory. They weren't forced off of that land like a lot of Native Americans were. And then their land happened to have oil on it, and that financed a lot of their education. So they weren't forced to live in poverty like a lot of Native Americans were. What I'm doing now is kind of like paying it forward.
What does it mean whenever you hear the word American? Just the word American. What do you think that means?
I think it means freedom.
Okay. What does it mean to be free?
I think freedom means they cannot boss you around.
They can't boss you around. Okay.
When I look at my childhood, I was very, very fortunate. And a lot of my kids, their families have to rely on welfare. A lot of my kids, one or both parents are incarcerated. I've got a lot of kids in foster care. But we want to encourage our students and let them know that they can go on, they can do whatever they want.
What does it mean to you, Nadir, whenever you hear the word American?
That you're free to decide who you want to become.
You are free to decide who you want to become. You're absolutely right. As long as you're willing to put in the work, you can be it. Okay?
Happy. Right.
We have some students now that have been to a different elementary school every 2 months. Their families go where the jobs are, or they go where rent is the cheapest. A lot of times when the kids come in, they're not at the reading level they should be. It's our job to get them there, but that takes more than just a 9-month period. We just play it like they're going to be here for the long haul. And some of the kids we see come back, and some we never see again.
Have a good one too. I still love you.
But I refuse to believe that these kids won't be better off in their future for what we're doing now. I don't want to think that they can't be.
I can't deny that the data show that the United States is becoming less mobile. Increasingly, if you're in that housing project, you're not going to get out of that housing project. And that's a tremendous danger to who we are, who we profess to be, and who we want to be. Because when you are a country that's based on an aspirational notion, it doesn't matter where you came from, it matters where you're going, it had better be true, because it's the only thing that's holding. There are always going to be gaps between a country's aspiration and the reality. And so we're always fighting to overcome that gap. We're always trying to get close to what the ideal is.
While teaching children about world religion, a teacher asked her students to bring a symbol of their faith to class. They did that. The first child said, "I'm Muslim, and this is my prayer rug." The second child said, "I'm Jewish, and this is my family menorah." The third child said, "I'm a member of the Black church, and this is a copy of my family's gospel songbook. And I also brought a copy of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so it goes in America.
I think everyone has to come to terms at some point with your home and how it shaped you.
Thanks be to God.
Growing up as a little girl in segregated Birmingham, Alabama, where you couldn't even go to a restaurant, couldn't go to a movie theater. America is yours, and you can succeed here. And as I think back, under the pressures of Jim Crow, segregation, with all of these negative signals around their kids about how America did not accept them, that's quite a trick that those parents pulled off. And it almost always, you could be educated. Then you had a kind of armor against prejudice, you had a kind of armor against barriers to opportunity. And so for Black American families, education became the Holy Grail. John Wesley Rice Sr., my grandfather, was a sharecropper's son in Greene County, Alabama. His mother was a freed slave who had taught him how to read, and he decides he's going to go to college. So he saved up his cotton, and he went off to Stillman in Tuscaloosa, paid for his first year of college, got through it, and then they said, "So how are you going to pay for your second year?" He said, "Well, I'm out of cotton." And they said, "Well, you're out of luck." He says to them, "So how are those boys going to college?" They said, "Well, what you have to understand is they have what's called a scholarship. And if you wanted to be a Presbyterian minister, then you could have a scholarship too. And my grandfather says, that is exactly what I had in mind. And my family's been Presbyterian, and by the way, college educated ever since. That access to education was going to change everything. And not just for him, but for generations to come. Granddaddy Rice founded churches in Mississippi and Louisiana and Alabama. And then it was his pattern to found not just a church, but a school. My grandfather would go door to door and say to parents, your daughter's smart and she ought to go to college. And so I'm going to get her a scholarship. For Granddaddy Rice, that was the promise of our country. That you can be and do anything you want, but you can't leave others behind. Faith matters. Family matters. Community matters. That was my family's tradition.
I think that an experience that made home very salient to me is a conversation I had with my grandfather. I remember remarking that home, or Collins, Mississippi, was just a very static place. It felt like change didn't happen. And then my grandfather just pointed out the fact that he was born in the Great Depression. He did not finish high school. His kids finished high school. And I'm going to arguably one of the best colleges in the nation and the world. And that his one lifetime has seen so much change.
When I think of home, I think of lots of amazing things. I think of the smell of my mom's cooking, and I think of my brother. But I also think of a lot of struggles that happened in my home and a lot of negative experiences that built me but also broke me down.
I think that what you all have just expressed is that it is crucial to remember who you are, where you've come from, the community that poured into you, and to always return to that.
Maybe America and being American is about bringing where we're from to where we're going and making that connection.
I'll be driving somewhere, and if I see a tattered flag, it drives me crazy. Like, I want to write a letter to Target and be like, your flag looks terrible, do something about it. Like, I really, and that's kind of ingrained.
I got in a heated debate with some idiot wearing the flag the wrong way the other day, wearing it as a cape. We got in an argument in a bar because he was stepping all over it, and I ripped it off of him, and I was just like, what are you doing, man? He's like, supporting America. And I'm like, by stomping all over the flag?
Like you said, it's like people bled for this. I can picture their faces in my head. Like, I can give you a list of names.
I always like to say that I could go on a road trip around America and I'd have a place to stay in every state because of being in the military. I love that sense of community, no matter what. We know that we have that common bond of service. I was 21 when I joined the Marine Corps. My grandpa was in the Army. My dad had been in the Army the whole time I was growing up. My little brother joined the Marine Corps right out of high school. And I got the bug. There's a picture that somebody took of me waiting for our plane to load to go overseas. And I have this huge, smile on my face. I'm like, girl, why did you take a rabbit with you to Iraq? Deep down inside, I was probably pretty nervous, knowing that I was getting out and doing something at the heart of what is important to my family, serving a nation during a time of war. really feel like people from rural areas know what hard work and dedication is, and we're patriotic. And, you know, it's common knowledge that people that live in rural areas, for the most part, are not millionaires unless you have a vacation home. I think that's what allures a lot of people to join the military. It's a great benefit to serve your country and be able to afford putting food in the mouths of your children.
That one?
Oh, this one, look at that. Which one is that?
That's actually the day I got back from basic training in 1983.
Oh, you look so young.
Aaron, bottle cap.
Growing up, you know, we didn't have a lot of money. We always felt like the underdog, kicking and fighting. We had to work for everything that we had. And the military was our career path.
I mean, it's not like we're the MacArthurs or anything. You know, bottom line, you volunteer to go out and be a bullet catcher or be a bullet launcher, one of the two.
Prefer launcher.
Yeah, prefer launcher. I mean, obviously the consequences are grave, but, or could be grave, but you, just do it.
We all were around when 9/11 happened. We were all united that one day. You know, some people may have been in Texas, some people may have been in New York City, some people may have been in Wisconsin. I was a sophomore in high school when that happened. And I really feel like it tugged at the patriotic heartstrings of people like myself and like my brother and my dad and my grandpa especially, who was too old to serve, but gosh darn it, he wanted to, you know? When a nation is under attack, you serve. Glamorous being support staff for an attack helicopter squad. But I know I had a purpose. You owed it to those family members. You owed it to those people that we lost. You know, some people are like, we shouldn't have gotten involved in this. We shouldn't have done this. We shouldn't have went overseas. Look at the cost of human life. It's like, yes, I've got it. But remember how you felt that day. You don't join the military to be in one political party or not. You are a Marine, and you can't pick political sides. But, you know, I live in Madison, Wisconsin. People love to protest. I go out on my lunch break and people are out there with signs and horns and bells and whistles and just hooting and hollering and making all this racket, yelling at the governor on the Capitol. And I think it's cool that they do that. I think the American ideal of citizenship is about service to others, either through military service or volunteerism or advocacy. And it's refreshing to see people paying attention to the government because they bring to light something that other people may have not been paying attention to. And I think that's really interesting. And even if I don't necessarily agree with their opinions, I still appreciate them because that freedom is the fabric of my uniform. You put that uniform on to protect their right to do that. And that's what it means to serve the country. You know, it's like, okay, yep, they're exercising their freedom of speech. My job, you know, is done.
1 week in a month, I go back to my reserve unit. It's the same people I deployed with, the same people I went to war with. And here I'm like the veteran in class, you know, and then people ask me military questions. I'm like the subject matter expert on everything military, apparently. But when I go back to my unit that 1 week in a month, I'm just Sergeant Legoski, the platoon sergeant. We all have the same mission, the same job. We rely on each other very equally. And I think taking that back here is that we can rely on everyone here in this room. And there isn't just us here, there's also people outside this room we can rely on, others who have the same ideals. We are all Americans. Yeah, we all have our different identities, but together I think we kind of want to raise the nation up. And, you know, we're not doing this alone.
All right, candidates, if you all please raise your right hand and repeat after me. I hereby declare on oath that I will support and defend the Constitution and laws of the United States of America against all
naturalization ceremonies, when immigrants become citizens of the United States. They are among the most moving things you could possibly attend. When you get to see a parade of people who have chosen to make this country their own, from all of these other parts of the world, and you watch them have that moment of claiming, it gives you new eyes to see what it is that we take for granted around us.
Today, this nation has welcomed 20 new citizens into the fold of American life. And as a second-generation American, all my life I have wondered, what would it be like to be like those of you who emigrated to this country, to make that choice and to make that leap? But also, what would it be like for all of us to have an opportunity together to celebrate the meaning and the content of our citizenship?
My parents are immigrants. They moved all across a war-torn China during the Sino-Japanese War and Second World War, and from Taiwan in the 50s came to the United States. They both pursued higher education here, and so I grew up in Poughkeepsie, New York, in the Hudson Valley. So it was this real American dream. It's especially heightened when you are second generation, and you really can visualize what it would have been like had you been born in the other place. Where would I be had my parents not made it to the United States? We sit here talking just a couple of weeks after the anniversary of the massacre on Tiananmen Square. I think about what it would have been like to have been a high schooler in Beijing and what choice I would have made. I had the good fortune to be born American. I can express my political opinions, and I'm not going to get just scooped up by cops in the middle of the night. And that has really fueled my sense of purpose. The entirety of my life after college has been in public work, either working in government or working to promote political engagement. I want for us as citizens to be as prepared and powerful and engaged and literate and ready to participate and contribute as we possibly can.
What we're talking about here in the civic context is how we treat one another. how we live in community, how we see ourselves as woven into a fabric of relationship and obligation. And that notion is what our broken, fissured, fragmented body politic today needs deeply. Citizen University is a nonprofit that works to foster a stronger culture of citizenship in the United States. We convene leaders from the left and the right to come together and learn together and solve problems together.
We need to make sure that the people that we put in office represent us and our issues. And if they don't, how can we bring that to light?
You have people working on immigration reform who've never met people from the veterans world, who've never met people who are thinking about civic education in the classroom. And so what Citizen University does is simply to stitch this ecosystem together.
Should we just set up around here?
But there's another set of things that Citizen University does that are much more about the culture.
So it's fun. Yeah, all of us. We stand there and we do an oath together.
It's taking an oath.
Hello. How are you? I'm Eric Liu.
Because we have a great diversity in American life, you have to ask yourself, what is it that holds us together? And what holds us together is a creed. And that creed, to me, is not just a bunch of legalistic principles. That creed operates at the gut and the heart, at least as much as at the level of the head. And it is truly a civic religion. And so one of the things that I feel like it's really important for us to do as Americans is just to renew that creed through rituals, simple rituals.
So this is a process we have called Sworn Again America. And the idea is if you've ever been to a ceremony where immigrants become citizens and they got to swear an oath, we thought, well, what if we all had a chance to actually pause for a minute and just swear this oath together? And so I'm just going to ask you to raise your right hand. I pledge to be an active American.
I pledge to be an active American.
To show up for others.
To show up for others.
To govern myself.
To govern myself.
To help govern my community.
To help govern my community.
I pledge to serve and to push my country.
I pledge to serve and push my country.
When right to be kept right.
When right to be kept right.
When wrong to be set right.
When wrong to be set right.
Wherever my ancestors and I were born.
Wherever my ancestors and I were born.
I claim America.
I claim America.
Congratulations, folks. You are now sworn again.
Amen.
Thank you very much for joining us again. How'd that feel for you all to do that? Did it?
That really touched me.
Doesn't it? Where are you from?
It's not just the oath. It's more about renewing our sense that we have a civic inheritance here and a set of values that are worth nurturing. That's the spark of Americanness that I hope does not get subdued even in this age of cynicism about what's possible in politics. Because when you stop showing up, you stop participating, you cede the field to the few who would like perfectly to command the field. And they usually don't have your interests in mind.
Part of what makes the United States exciting is that it is a place in which there's always a little bit of an edge. You are going to encounter people who are unlike yourself, ethnically, economically, politically. This extraordinary coming together of people from everywhere, from every circumstance, from every religion. What infrastructure is it that is needed to support that? What set of responsibilities and obligations support that? What relationship to what the government does and what individuals do? It's a pretty complex story. Whenever I talk to people about our common aspirational narrative as being what holds us together, they say, yeah, that's what I think too. To be American is to accept the call of aspiration. To be American is to break with the idea that you are a prisoner of your circumstances. And I think to be American is also to accept that it's not just about you. You really do need to care about the collective enterprise too.
And I think the more we lose sight of that in an era of racial and ethnic fragmentation and political polarization and income inequalities, the more things that push us away from that sense of we're all in this together, that we have a responsibility and a duty to build and sustain healthy communities, not just healthy individual lives, the more trouble we have going forward.
I believe as a nation, we are not living up to our ideals. We need to be concerned with every kid in the nation, not just our own.
The biggest hope for our country, that we don't forget where we came from. But also at the same time, I'm looking forward to being absorbed into the new traditions or the new rituals or the new whatevers that are brought in by the different cultures.
The Marines haven't gotten anywhere doing things by themselves. And I think it would really behoove the American public to know your neighbors and to build that community.
America has nothing to hold itself together but a few ideas, a creed. Another way to put that is, all we have to hold us together is a story. And I think one thing we have learned, whether from the right or the left, is don't expect some archangel to come down and descend and give us that story.
If I could ask every person in America, I think it would be to have everyone have a conversation like this, where people genuinely put their identities and their concerns about the nation on the table. Because I don't think any other time I've felt more American. And so frustrated with what it means to be American, but also so proud.
For educator resources and more stories, visit pbs.org/American Creed. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting as part of American Graduate. Let's Make It Happen, a nationwide public media education initiative. Support for this program was provided by Emerson Collective, GenStar Capital, Carnegie Corporation of New York, the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, the Once Upon a Time Foundation, Todd Wagner Foundation, the Mackenzie Foundation of San Francisco, Nicholas Berggruen Charitable Foundation, Sandhill Foundation, and California Humanities.
We don't expect it to, but worst case.
Exactly. Back up.
Well, so what did you all think? I loved it. I've seen it before, and it was wonderful to see it again and take more in. As I said before the film, this will be an opportunity for the three of us to have a conversation and then have some time so that you all can engage with us as well. I want to more formally introduce those who have joined me on the stage. Sitting to my left in the center is Professor David Kennedy, who's one of the producers of the film, along with former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. He is the Donald J. McLaughlin Professor of History, Emeritus at Stanford University. And as I understand it, became a historian because you were interested in this question of whether or not America has a national character or not. And so you have spent your career interrogating that question. We'll have an opportunity to discuss that with you. And I also should mention that the documentary that you just saw in 2018 was one of the most watched documentaries on PBS. And you think of all the fantastic documentaries you see on PBS, so congratulations to you on that.
Very good.
And then sitting to the left of Professor Kennedy is my good friend for many, many years, John Bridgeland, or as I call him, Bridge. So if I slip into that, you'll know why. And John was the domestic policy advisor to President George W. Bush. I should also add that he is also a film producer, as the film Sea of Hope, and has written widely about issues of American culture and national service and national character and a whole set of other issues. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
I wanted to start out, Professor Kennedy, asking you this question. We saw a little snippet in the very beginning when you were sitting at the table with students, you and Secretary Rice, and she mentioned that you all had a conversation about America. The two of you have been talking about America. And then fast forward, we watch this fantastic documentary. I'm curious, tell us a little bit more about that initial set of conversations with Secretary Rice and what prompted you all to decide to make this film. What questions were you trying to answer? What did you hope to accomplish?
Well, this goes back, the conversations that Condi, I call her Condi as you call him Bridge, because I've known her for a long, long time. We've had several conversations over many years. In fact, in some sense, I hired Condi at Stanford. I signed her original appointment papers when I was a dean, so we go back a long way. And we've had conversations over many years about what this country's all about, what's the essential character of it, what are its issues, how does its historical legacy give us any guidance about what the future might hold, or about what our responsibilities are as active citizens today. So this is a deep, long conversation that we've had over decades, really. But sometime, I don't know exactly, 4, 5, 6 years ago, we had a particularly pointed conversation about this. And it had to do with how she and I came from very different places in life and situations and the social fabric of this society, and yet here we both ended up teaching at Stanford University, and we had a lot of things in common, including a shared anxiety about the state of our culture, political culture especially, in the present moment. So that's how the film really got going. Our original idea, actually, academics that we are, was to write a book together. But mercifully, we thought we might reach more eyeballs if we did it as a film. And then we made the acquaintance of the executive producer of the film, Sam Ball, whose name you saw in the credits there, from a company called Citizen Film in San Francisco, who is a very clever, excellent filmmaker. So that's how we got the product that we you know about it. But those students who are around the table with us in that seminar room that you see early on in the film, and you see them again later on, every single one of those students is what we call a FLIP, which is a student acronym at Stanford for First Generation Low Income Partnership. That's the P part. Every one of those kids is the first in their family to go to college. So they have a particular investment, you might say, in thinking through what it means to be in a society that affords that kind of opportunity, what sort of responsibility. Lots of the conversations that we had around that table that don't show up really pointedly in the film were about several of these young people's anxiety that they were equipping themselves to transcend their communities of origin and escape them. And they worried about that. They wanted to stay in contact with the towns they grew up in, the cities they grew up in, the communities that nurtured them. But they realized that one possibility for them was to leave that all behind and go off into some greater world. So it's an old American story, it seems to me, about opportunity can also be alienating.
I know we often hear that with students, first generation students. I remember a trip that I took with President Ryan before he started officially here, and we went to UVA's campus at Wise, Virginia, and a number of students were also talking about that, their concerns, as well as the concerns that exist in their families about the very same thing. John, I'm wondering if you can tell us before we delve more deeply into some of these issues, tell us your reaction when you saw this film. I know from our conversation that these are issues that you've often thought about, and talked about.
So just first, I've seen it, I think, 15 times now. That's more than I have. I love it. But I think one of my favorite moments was I was in Cleveland Public Schools trying to look at programs that were reaching deeply into the community. It had originally a graduation rate around 52%, so about half of these classes weren't even graduating from high school in an economy where they need not only to finish high school but get some college. And I walked into a classroom, I think it was teaching American history, and they had a clip of American Creed. and to watch these young people who were growing up in poverty with stories very much like in this film. And what I love about American Creed, again, the 15th time I've seen it, I sat here and I thought about the story of my father, who grew up in shoeless poverty in Belleville, Ohio. His mother worked in the tire and rubber company factory in Akron, and how through educational opportunity and the relentlessness of a parent, a single mom, he was able to literally experience the American dream and then pass that heritage on to us. The other thing I liked about it was it not only talks about the individual story, but we're here in Virginia. My father always reminded me that when Jefferson's mystical notion of the pursuit of happiness, we changed life, liberty, and property from Locke to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to get away from a feudal society and a class-driven society. That this notion of the pursuit of happiness was a cooperative enterprise that we help one another achieve. And so it wasn't just about our own individual story, our own individual happiness. And I see Gail Lefkowitz in the audience. Gail and I, we been part of something called the National Conference on Citizenship, and every single year we welcome in people who are doing the naturalization ceremony, much like Eric Liu showed us. And I was at I had the privilege of both serving President Obama and President Bush, and I say that just so that if there's this polarization in the audience, it will stand down. But I was at a reunion with President Bush and all the senior staff, and he stood up and he said, I'm not commenting a lot on our immigration debate right now, but I just want to say that immigrants renew the American spirit. They constantly remind us of the land of opportunity and how fragile that line between freedom and the lack thereof can be. And so I think this film reinforces so many concrete values. And I guess the last thing I'll say is I just was so struck by how intuitive and perceptive and how much the students gravitated naturally, whether they were elementary school students or Stanford students, in talking about what the American idea and the American creed means. So I think it's deep in their DNA.
Mm-hmm. And Have you ever attended a naturalization ceremony?
We do it every year in connection with the National Conference on Citizenship, and I am just so inspired.
It is deeply moving.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I had the opportunity when I was in the Obama administration to speak at a naturalization ceremony on Ellis Island on July the 2nd. And it was just one of the highlights of my tenure there.
Yeah. My mother is a naturalized citizen. She was born in Ireland, raised in Canada, naturalized in the United States in 1940. And at that time, it was a written exam. And it was a serious exam.
Yeah.
It's now 10 questions you have to pass, 7 I think it's an oral exam, and it's frankly pretty low bar. But when my mother passed away, I dug out a lot of her possessions and came across a copy of her citizenship exam. One of the questions that she had to answer in writing was, describe the historical circumstances surrounding the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the American Constitution. And she passed.
Right. Which is important to note, and how many of us who were born here can answer those questions, and the importance of being able to understand those questions and the history that they're rooted in.
The Woodrow Wilson Foundation about a year ago did a poll, a series of polls actually, in all 50 states. And they asked a group of citizens, native-born citizens, questions from the current naturalization exam. 2/3 of Americans across the country could not pass the exam. 2/3.
Yeah.
The other thing, Mel, that struck me was watching, it was Joe Haddon, and they're coming in here, they're taking our jobs. What's interesting about immigrants is, in addition to the, renewing our understanding of America's creed and why it's so valuable, is they play an outside role in entrepreneurship. I mean, to actually come to this country with nothing is an entrepreneurial act in and of itself. But the data show that they play an outsized role in actually creating a lot of the new jobs in this country, from the billionaires who create lots of jobs to the mom and pop enterprises. So they actually have a very positive economic effect on the country.
I come to you in part as an emissary from that separate country known as Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is centered in Santa Clara County, California. And in about no more than 4 years from now, Santa Clara County will have an ethnic majority. It's currently a majority-minority county, and it'll be Asian.
Yeah.
The heart of Silicon Valley will be majority Asian.
And the country, as we know, those demographic shifts are not only taking place, but they're picking up size and speed, which I think is one of the things that creates some of the angst, along with economic insecurity in our country. And I want to ask a question related to that. As we all know, the Constitution starts "we the people." And that "we" is one that I think there are some people who read it and say, that's me. The rights, the obligations, the responsibilities, everything that comes with that "we" is me. And there are others who read it, understanding our country's struggle to expand the "we" legally and culturally, who don't necessarily see themselves reflected in that. And in fact, there was a poll, recent poll, fall 2019 poll, that shows that for many Latinos and African Americans, when they think of that "we" and they think of American culture, they think it should be one of diverse cultures and perspectives and values. And for many whites who are also in that AP poll, that they think there should be a more unified culture and set of values. And I'm wondering, in that cacophony, in that tension, in that friction about many, one, how we go about approaching this idea of an American creed. I mean, if we are struggling with identity and values and what they are, how do we go on to this idea of a creed?
Well, I think that in some ways is the jackpot question, and it's been with us for a long, long time. I think back in the centuries in early American history, the lines of division between different communities were defined differently than they are today. But the question is an old one. It goes back to our national motto, E pluribus unum, out of many one. I think the trick, the balancing act, the art of it all, the art of our society's long-term arc of history, is how do you make one out of many without extinguishing the many? Without absolutely committing some kind of cultural genocide on all the patrimonial cultures that have come here, honoring their values and honoring diversity, but still, out of that, arriving at some common sense of community and shared values. And I don't think there's any algorithm or silver bullet about that. It's an ongoing project. My own view, and I think I share this with Condoleezza Rice, and that's why we made the film, is that as a society we've given insufficient attention to that project in the last, 3-4 decades maybe, and we need to renew our commitment to make that work.
Yeah, I would say I'm reminded of, I think it was Justice Thurgood Marshall who said, I don't celebrate the original Constitution, but I celebrate what it's become. Because I think at the time of the founding, there were something like 4 million, only 4 million, it's remarkable, isn't it, Americans in the United States, and most of them couldn't vote. You know, blacks who were enslaved, women, Native Americans, men even who didn't, have the sufficient assets for the payroll tax in many states. And so we think about we the people, and it's, as Condi said, and David said, it's very aspirational. I'd also note, it's interesting to me that, and I'm so glad David, through books and the Creed and all his work, is promoting this idea of a national character. Because I think, I think it was Arthur Schlesinger who said, too much pluribus, not enough unum. And we value our diversity so much, and it's such a strength. It's the strength of our country. But I don't think, we don't actually ask very much of our citizens. They pay taxes, some of them vote. I just got summoned for jury duty. It's a particularly inconvenient time, but I will go. But I think we need more mechanisms. And the Little League baseball fields are great to bring people of different backgrounds together. But I actually think the country needs a bold idea like large-scale national service. That would bring black and white and brown, people of different faiths, politics, income levels together in shared purpose. Could be the military, could be civilian national service. I'm thinking we should pray for President Carter right now in surgery. He fell at 95 doing a Habitat for Humanity build. I mean, that's sort of the spirit of cooperative enterprise that I think has kept that president and man alive, and that we have to kind of instill in our young people that as they come into adulthood, this sort of common expectation and opportunity to give something back to their country, I think is something that the country really needs now more than ever.
And Bridge, say a little bit more about why you think national service does that. What is it that happens in that Habitat for Humanity, to AmeriCorps, to military service? I mean, what happens there that helps to...
I had a little experience that might be worth relating. I have co-chaired with Ethel Kennedy something called the Earth Conservation Corps. You know, she could do anything in America, and she's spending her time co-chairing this little nonprofit on the banks of Anacostia, reaching the most vulnerable kids in Washington, D.C. who, you know, wake up to the sound of gunfire and they view the nation's capital, you know, just the irony. And so we go out and we do these service projects, and this team came together and they discovered that the bald eagle was absent from Washington, D.C. since 1947. And they organized an effort to fledge bald eagles from Wisconsin, bring them to the nation's capital, and are part of the team. In fact, 60 Minutes did a segment called Endangered Species about the bald eagle that they returned to the nation's capital, the nation's symbol, and the young people who are on the verge of being outcast from society. So I think at the end of our service projects, I've asked the young people and those in the surrounding community, tell me about yourselves. Lots of Democrats, some Republicans, some independents, a libertarian, lots of Christians, Jews, Muslims, people in poverty, people from McLean in Virginia and Potomac, Maryland, you know, of great wealth, who often learn far more from the experience than the vulnerable kids who are serving day in and day out. And so I think, one, it could heal a divided nation. Two, it could solve public challenges at low cost to taxpayers. And third, would cultivate a generation of leaders who could learn to work together, whether it's in a state house or city council or in the U.S. Congress, across difference instead of what we have today in the divisiveness.
You know, I think the way you've just described it is terrific. I'm much more attracted to the idea of community service as a kind of programmatic label rather than national service. When you say national service, people start thinking immediately about the military, which is the one truly national institution that lends itself to this purpose. But community service, as a phrase, has got a bad name. It's something that people are sentenced to.
Yes, right.
And that shouldn't be the case. Community service should be something that we should be proud of, and we should honor people who do it. And you've worked in this vineyard a lot longer than I have, and more consequentially, but I would like to see a consortium of college presidents, university presidents around the country say that they would give preference in admission, or a little extra weight in admission, to students who had done some kind of meaningful community service.
So I'll just say quickly, in the Commonwealth of Virginia with the governor and first lady, we spent the last 5 years lining up every college in Virginia as a pilot experiment to look at what they could do in admissions to give a preference, whether they could give young people a gap year before they start and keep their spot in the class, whether they could fund service fellowships for students, connect federal work-study programs so that students aren't working in cafeterias and libraries to pay off their student loans, but they're actually serving in the community. And we got every college but one, and we're still working on Liberty University, which turns out to have the highest number of AmeriCorps participants. And I would also just say, when you look at Shriver's February 1961 memo to President Kennedy on the establishment of the Peace Corps, he actually didn't want to create just a federal program called Peace Corps. He wanted to run it through colleges and universities all across the United States. And, but the infrastructure didn't exist in 1961, but it does today. And so I think a big moment for the country could be its colleges and universities supporting this, you know, systemically supporting the spirit of service. Stanford does a lot of this too.
Well, and Bridge, one of the things that we worked on together is this movement of young people, young adults 16 to 24. Most people at that time referred to them as disconnected or at-risk youth. One of the things that we worked on with them was changing the narrative. We're not disconnected, we're not at risk. We're opportunity youth. We have a vision for ourselves and for our future. And they're a group that came together, an organization that's still very strong, Council of Young Leaders and Opportunity Youth United. So these are not young people who by any means have had an easy life. Some of them engaged the juvenile justice system. Some of them aged out of foster care and tough times there. The list goes on. But together they have said, we are committed to community service as part of what we do, and being a part of this country and engaging as voters, empowering ourselves and our peers. So this is something that is for all people across class lines and race and ethnicity. But I think to the point both of you are making, a way of bringing people together and connecting to a common enterprise, kind of the common wheel.
I just have to say, when you have such an outstanding person in government like Melody, magical things can happen. And she got President Obama to focus this White House Council on the 6.7 million young people who are disconnected from school and work. And because of her work, including through the Aspen Institute here at the Miller Center, that number's down to like 4 million. It's been a really tremendous success story. One thing though, 70% of these opportunity youth wanted to serve in their communities, and only 3% were doing so. So there's this huge sort of opportunity service gap that we need to close in this country.
Of course, there's what you might call an antecedent question about what is the community to which people can attach themselves, in which they can serve. And it went by quickly in the film, and you might not have noticed it, but Deirdre, the principal of the school in Oklahoma, mentions that many of her students are only in her school for 2 months. And they're on the move all the time. Well, what does community mean for people who are that fluid and on the move constantly? There's really nothing to attach themselves to.
And did you find, as you all were moving across the country, and I love we were crisscrossing it and watching the documentary, how people identified and made and created community in a way that helped attach them to this idea of a common creed or common character, national character?
The diversity, the variety of that was really quite impressive. There are some people who clearly are very actively participatory in their communities, and we salute them. There are others who join communities like the Marine Corps, in Tegan's case, for example. One of the most moving to me vignettes, as we call them, making the film, that does not show in this version of the film. There's an 83-minute version. You've just seen a 53-minute version. You can stream the 83-minute version from the PBS website if you like. But there's a segment in there where a woman named Joan Blades, who was a founder of MoveOn.org, a very liberal organization, and a guy whose name I can't remember for the moment, lives in Grass Valley, California, and he's the founder of the Tea Party. And they get together, and they're very wary of each other, and they create a community, in essence, out of whole cloth, of people from their followings who pledge to get together on a regular basis, once every month or two, in each other's homes and discuss a given issue. And it is really something to see them, even in the 10 or 12 minutes worth of film that you see them. You can see them building increment by increment a sense of community amongst themselves across a gap that they thought was unbridgeable when they started. There's one particularly humorous moment when the guy calls his sister in Texas and tells her that he's about to host this pinko radical move-on lady from Berkeley, California, in his home for dinner, and he's having some other people over too. And he said, "I'm really nervous." He said, can you give me any advice? I don't even know what liberals eat. So sometimes it's that elementary.
Right.
But they built it. They did, and that's an ongoing deal.
Exactly, and it shows you just how disconnected people can be, and unattached to our own just common humanity.
Yeah.
One of the things I also want to probe, Secretary Rice says in the documentary that our values unite us. These aspirational goals, achievement, opportunity, freedom. And then at the same time, you are quoted, and correct me if I get this wrong, talking about the myth around these aspirational values, but also saying every country needs myths. And I'm curious how we should think about that myth here in the United States, and both its benefit that you seem to speak to, but what are the dangers of that? And how do we use that myth to get closer to the aspiration, to close that delta between reality and what we hope for in our democratic principles?
Well, I do say that you stand uncorrected, because I did say the word myth. I'm not sure that was precisely the right word to use.
Okay.
What I really was getting at was we need a set of shared values, common beliefs. They may not be 100% mappable onto reality, but they constitute a kind of an aspirational agenda toward which we want to work together. And that, if there is such a thing as a master narrative of the whole arc of American history, it seems to me it has to do with something you mentioned a moment ago about just how do you define that circle of we and we the people. And the master narrative of American history has been, I think, one quite defensible way to tell the story is that circle has expanded quite palpably, measurably over the centuries. And that's part of what is the genius of our national project. So I think that's, again, I repeat what I said a moment ago, I think we've paid insufficient attention to that. The stresses and strains that the expansion of that circle that we can impose on this or any other similarly aspirational society. Again, I'll say something maybe a little bit controversial, maybe it cuts across the grain of the film a little bit. But I've just come from almost 6 weeks in China, traveling fairly extensively and then teaching for several weeks in Beijing. And I met a lot of Chinese students, Chinese scholars, and so on. And that's a pretty homogeneous society. But on its borders, interestingly, just geostrategically, on its borders, there are a number of minority communities, especially in the far western China, in Xinjiang province, where I spent about a week, especially in the city of Kashgar, where the Muslim minority called the Uyghurs live. And the Uyghurs are under really terribly suppressive policies now, and they're suffering what can only be called some kind of cultural genocide, I think. But living in that society for several weeks did make me reflect that I think it's naive to think that any society can be just infinitely elastic in the numbers of different peoples that it can really productively include in the body politic or the body social. We need to be realistic about that, I think. And I think we can't just assume that somehow by osmosis, newcomers to our society are just automatically going to make their way, weave their way into the fabric of our being as a country. And we have to take that on as a project and take positive steps to make sure that people whom we welcome into our midst are then attended to. And we take positive steps to make sure that they're productive and engaged citizens.
Well, I want to ask a follow-up question, but I will say, and we did not set this up today, if you look at today's UVA Today, there is a cover story about the work that's taking place in one of the humanities labs that's part of the Democracy Initiative, the Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab, and one of the students who is Uyghur, and talks about his work and his research related to his family and his ancestry and the work of the lab to make people more aware of what's happening to the Uyghurs and issues that intersect with that of democracy and democratic principles and culture. So I commend you all to UVA Today as well.
Is he from China?
Yes, his family, yes. But I'm curious, in committing ourselves to that project, if we could talk, you could talk a little bit about both the individual and the institutional. Because often when we are having these kinds of conversations, we talk about how we can engage one to another, which is critically important, and how we can build community. But I'm also curious about your thoughts about what role for institutions and systems, particularly as we were thinking of issues of equity, and we were talking about, and as you did in the film, issues of mobility. What role for both of those things in the American experiment?
Well, let's confine the discussion for these purposes just to immigration, since that is a topical issue, and there's 40-some million immigrants in our midst. Historically, we have committed few, if any, public resources to the project of assimilation or absorption of immigrants into our society. There are some very famous private efforts to do that kind of thing. Jane Addams at Hull House in Chicago in the 19th century, Lillian Wald at Henry Street Settlement in New York be another. The much maligned Rod Blagojevich, when he was governor of Illinois, to say something nice about Rod Blagojevich, you can alert the media, this doesn't happen very often. But he succeeded in getting the Illinois legislature to make a significant appropriation of public monies to facilitate the English language acquisition and civics education and so on, job training even, of aspirant immigrants. We don't do very much of that as a society. So I think that's one institutional response is that public agencies, states, federal government maybe, ought to take seriously that you can't just say, welcome to America, here's your citizenship paper, now you're on your own. That's just a little too simple, it seems to me, in real terms. So all these community efforts like Joe Madden and Hazleton and others, the kinds of things that you've been doing, all wonderful. But I think that this should be more of a, on the public agenda as well.
Right, can take to
Yeah,
scale.
I would just
Bridge.
add, I'm still stuck on what liberals eat for dinner, but I want the answer to that question. I want to know what the Tea Partiers eat too. I bet it's largely the same thing. But you know, I spent a lot of time in schools, and it's like, you know, there's nothing worse than having a creed or a myth that's not accessible. And it's like young people are growing up in two educational nations. I wondered for a long time why the high school dropout problem wasn't on the national radar. And we discovered that the vast majority of students are in high schools that have 90% or higher graduation rates with, in many cases, helicopter parents who, from very early childhood, had what Bob Putnam calls a lot of good night moon time reading and a lot of investment in them. And then there's a subset of the population that are trapped in what are called these dropout factory high schools, where literally the graduation rate's 40% or lower. So imagine going to a high school where most of your peers will drop out. And this seems just, you know, statistical, but I was in Philadelphia behind the glass. We were interviewing dropouts all over the country to understand why they dropped out, what would have kept them in school, what their ambitions were. And we had this story of a young African-American woman who had taken over the whole focus group. She was so bright and engaged. And we asked her, what do you want to be when you grow up? She said, I wanted to be an astrophysicist. And we said, a what? And she said, I wanted to be inspired with the NASA space program. And 20 minutes later, we go on to learn that she's a prostitute on the streets of Philadelphia. And that's a kind of an over-dramatized story, but she was trapped in one of these schools. People didn't know her name. They didn't know what she wanted to be. They didn't connect courses of study to who she could become. And so you talk about institutions. We have a lot of work to do in reforming, redesigning, giving choice, if that's needed, to that subset of students who are trapped in these very horrific places, frankly, that aren't giving them access to the American dream and the American creed. And on your point about, when I'm talking about national service, I'm actually talking about a $10 billion investment every year. So that when you do your U.S. selective service, yeah, you know, like I did at 18, I found out I could serve one of the 5 branches of the military. But for the 75% of young people who actually don't qualify for the military because they've dropped out of high school, they've had bad behavior, they've had poor health. We now have Condoleezza Rice, Robert Gates, General McChrystal, the whole military community behind large-scale civilian national service. So that you have like Habitat for Humanity or City or Teach for America. You can choose those things as well. And that the federal government needs to make a large-scale investment in that, which, by the way, Democrats, Republicans, and independents all pretty strongly support. So we ought to get about doing it.
Do you all find, I'm just curious about this from my own experience working on policy, that times of boom or bust, so economic highs and economic lows, affect not only the way that we look at these issues as a country, but the way that we approach these issues as a country? Do we become more expansive or do we contract further during those periods? And how does that affect the myth and the sense of mobility, the dream that anything is possible? And given where we are now, what does that mean for us?
You make me think of a famous aphorism that I heard from the lips of one of my great mentors, great historian David Potter, who said, all societies have the values that they can afford. And I think there's something profound about that times get tougher, people get nastier. Times are better, people are more generous. And I think that's just a kind of a basic rule of human life. So yeah, I think that fundamental factor of a healthy economy is the underlayment of all these other issues that we're talking about.
I'd have two amendments. One would be, interestingly, our largest and only large-scale experiment in civilian national service in history was during the Great Depression, when Franklin Roosevelt, who had had experience with the Boy Scouts and mobilizing young men into the woods for public purposes, think about this, calls Congress into emergency session within just a few months, has 250,000 young unemployed men who literally were festering in the streets. They couldn't support their families, doing public spirited work under the guidance of a young George C. Marshall, who organized all these camps. And it was, at the end of it, it's just amazing. 3 billion trees were planted, huge climate effect. 84 million acres of land were protected, which is the equivalent to our entire acreage of our national park system today. And all these families were fed.
Appalachian Trail.
The Appalachian Trail.
Civic
You
Crest
can't
Trail.
go into a national park without seeing the CCC boys having done something. The other thing I'd say that's really interesting is in time, we did this Civic Health Index that Mel and I have been working on, and it showed that the people who are the most likely to give during an economic downturn are actually the most impoverished. They open up their homes, they give the food they have. It's really dramatic data, remarkable data. And sort of, I don't know, becoming of, I've lived it, I've experienced it, I'm going to lend a helping hand. So the nation has done it with things like the CCC, and in times of economic bust, Americans are awesome. Individual Americans step forward and help neighbors in need.
Yeah, and something to think about how we build upon that, particularly as we watch the stretching, so that we've got extreme wealth and people who are pushed further down on the economic ladder. I mean, how we have the values that we need, not just those that we can afford, and how we build on that generosity, both individually as well as what needs to happen institutionally. So I'm curious, I want to open up the floor to you all to find out what questions that you all might have and how you want to engage our panelists as well. If you could raise your hand and let us know. We've got two in the back. We'll start the women in the very, very back and then come forward.
It's been very informative so far. Thank you so much. I have to say the silver bullet is love. It's the one word that is operative. And when you love your neighbor, whomever your neighbor may be, whatever color, it makes all the difference in the world. I lived outside of the country for 16 years in Switzerland, back to the concept of American. And I remember in Geneva at the time they had celebrations for the 4th of July because it was a large international community at that time. And I could barely, the national anthem, you just tear up because being able to say what you need to say as an American when you become a citizen or in school, when you're, the patriotism that rose up in me when I was not in a country where I could, be the American I was, more international. Also, I just came from Chicago where I was at a mini Smith College reunion, and one of the 8 women, we were the class of 1965, was one of the 6 women who were in the college at that time who were black. And I learned so much that I never knew at the time I was living with her, what she had gone through. And she is now running a fabulous, helping women in the New York City area. She's found over 40,000 jobs and done vocational training. And yet, some people look at her and say, I can hardly get this out of my mouth, but she said, this weekend, she said, how many people have said to her, go back where you came from? And she's traced her through Ancestry.com, and her family's been here since the 1700s. It's just odd when people say something because they see You know, they see, but they don't understand and they don't know. Anyway, it's been wonderful, and I'm very grateful to be an American, and I'm very grateful because I just came from Normandy 2 weeks ago, where I got to sing the national anthem at the cemetery and walk on Omaha Beach, and I could barely sing the last line of our national anthem because I was just overwhelmed. And one last thing, there was a woman who had 3 flags. She was a 93-year-old woman who had a Canadian flag, an American flag, and a British flag, and she was hanging out her window when she knew that American tourists were coming by, because when the French were liberated, she had those flags out her window and she's still waving them.
Yeah.
You know, so anyway, I just think it's fantastic that you're done this American creed. But the thing is to love one another and to actually pay attention to who's around you and not what color they are. I'm also a person who runs towards someone who does not look like me because I want to know. Thank you.
All right.
Just one aside, John Bridgeland, let us know if you want to run for president, because I guarantee you it would be a wonderful for what you preach and your thoughts and your background. Question. David, John, Melanie, tell us about the breakdown of many of these stories were about families. We have a breakdown of the American nuclear family, or this country, or the family in general. Higher divorces, fatherless marriage. How does that impact on the American creed?
I'll go quickly. First, I want to acknowledge love. In American schools, until about a decade ago, it was principally about academic instruction. And now there's a whole movement behind the integration of social, emotional, and academic learning and development, recognizing that children and young people are whole human beings who have social and emotional needs. It was interesting, Oprah Winfrey called this national commission we were working on. She said, I worry about the African-American girls. They're like Condi. They graduate, they're doing beautifully, and then they get to college and they flame out because of the trauma, the social emotional dimensions. So I think this notion of actually teaching empathy and love, and think about our Congress right now and our country right now. Those things are kind of fundamental, and if they're not cultivated really early in education and schools and families. To your point about family breakdown, if you read this wonderful book by Robert Putnam called Our Kids, the American family is changing, and a lot of it is extraordinary, wonderful, and opening up of. But it's the data is overwhelming that a stable 2-parent family is the single most important factor in a child's life, and the outcomes, their educational achievement, their economic opportunity, even their civic engagement. And so whether it's 2 men or 2 women, or a woman and a man, or whatever the nuclear family is today, having that good night moon time and strong supports, the relentlessness of adults and loving parents is the single best elixir to move our children forward. So I'm glad you raised both love and family, and you didn't talk beforehand, and yet they knitted together.
I agree with that, and Robert Putnam is one of my heroes, as well as I take it yours. Probably most famous, for those of you who maybe don't keep up with these things, for his article became a book called Bowling Alone, which reminds us that the issue here about social fragmentation, alienation, isolation, it has to do with changes in the nature of the family, to be sure, but it's bigger than that all kinds of civic institutions have weakened over the last generation or two, according to Putnam's data. So bowling alone is the metaphor. There are fewer bowling leagues than there used to be. People are still bowling as much as ever, but not in leagues, and that's just the kind of shorthand version of the general problem he's talking about. And there are some truly sobering data from things like the General Social Survey, the Pew Research Center, about how not only how people have lost, we as a people have lost confidence in our institutions, but we've lost confidence in each other. We don't trust each other. And the data, the time series data, are really compelling and very, very sobering. Most of the time series that I know go back to roughly 1970 as the baseline. You trace it from there. And it's a steady decline in our confidence in our institutions, with the single exception of the military. where we have more confidence in the military now than we used to, but that's the one exception. And we have less confidence in one another, and you break it down, you parse it by age, and the age group that has the least trust amongst themselves about other people are millennials, the youngest people. So this is a terrible future for our society when the youngest among us are the least trusting of one another. So I'm all in favor of love and family, don't get me wrong. But the data are sobering about how some of these bonds of affection are getting harder and harder to maintain.
Yeah. I just want to build on that very quickly. Do I?
Yeah, please go.
So Putnam, interestingly, 4 civic intermediary institutions that used to knit us together, the religious and civic associations, the loss of daily newspapers that gave us a common culture, language, and opportunities to give back to the community, unions, and the collapse of political parties for grassroots organizing. And so Putnam says, what's actually taking the place? Now, and then put on top of that the breakdown of the American family and a subset of schools that don't give young people access to a decent education. And that's why I think we need civic glue. And I think one idea is large-scale civilian national service. There will be others. But I don't think technology and Facebook causes and some of these online interactions are sufficient. I think you need face-to-face, real-world experiences, shared experiences that lift people. I think people want to be lifted out of their ordinary lives to do extraordinary things. Bill Buckley wrote this book about the country called Gratitude, that we ought to be thankful for living in the country that, freest country on earth, and everybody wants to be a knight at some level and to give back and do something extraordinary. And when we're turning away 5 times as many young people who are raising their hand to serve their country in, groups like the Peace Corps, Teach for America, others, and only 1 out of 5 get to serve, that's sort of a national disgrace, and that's something we could fix.
Well, and we know that foundationally, in a constitutional republic, this idea of civic virtue and civic health, the health and well-being and security of the whole, that our unenlightened self-interest has to be set aside for something that is larger than we are, is foundational to a healthy and vibrant constitutional republic. So when those things start to break down, or when they haven't been properly formed, we see the result. We see the fruit of that. In the very back.
So thank you for the film and for coming to UVA. I'm an undergrad here, and so I've really enjoyed this. So my question is, do you see the way we think and talk about freedom as one of the obstacles to rebuilding this kind of common creed? Because in the film we saw one student say, freedom is being your own boss. And that seems to run that seems to run counter to the idea of committing yourself to an institution where people are in charge and you're committed to something beyond yourself.
Very interesting point. And you make me think of a famous pronouncement that happened in this very state by one of the great figures of Virginia history, Patrick Henry. Give me liberty or give me death. What did he mean by liberty? I don't think he meant what those kids in Oklahoma were saying about, just nobody can boss me around and I'm my own man and so on. I think what liberty meant in the context in which he made that famous statement is give me the right to participate in the life and governance of my community. Liberty was the right to be a participating citizen and not be dictated to by a distant monarch or whatever. So that, if you think it through, and if we could get that lesson through in basic civics classes, what liberty means, what freedom means, really is the freedom to be part of an organic community that is self-governing. That's the whole idea of the American experiment.
And never forget, in the walls of the Aspen Institute, they have this. If you haven't done it, you might go out to the Aspen Ideas Festival. Sometimes it's just so inspiring to see all these extraordinary Americans, people from around the world who are doing such innovative things. It reminds you sort of the untapped potential in the country that's not being unleashed. And on the wall it said, when the Athenians, more than they wanted freedom, they wanted a comfortable life. And when the Athenians wanted most was freedom from responsibility, then Athens ceased to be free. So I think, the founders worried a lot about in creating a government so strongly predicated on rights, right at a time when they had fought a revolution to secure those rights, future generations distant from what it took to fight a revolution would neglect their duties, and they actually wanted to create, Madison and Washington wanted to create a national university that would constantly remind young people of not just the duties of citizenship, but the skills and aptitudes and behaviors that could represent it. And a lot of universities, including the University of Virginia, claim to be that. So you're very fortunate to be a student here.
But you can take it through to another step, take it up to the present day, 21st century. If you want to draw up a list of what are the stipulated formal obligations of citizenship today.
Yeah.
It's a very short list.
Right.
Yes, jury duty, I think, is just about the only one.
Taxes, jury duty.
No, you don't have to be a citizen to pay taxes.
Oh, that's true. Okay, fair enough. Fair enough.
You don't have to be a citizen to serve in the military.
Yeah.
You have to be a citizen to serve on a jury, but that's about it.
Yeah, you're right.
Well, there's something wrong with that.
That is not good.
Yes, sir, and then we'll come forward.
Yeah, I hear a lot today about the only thing we need, the only thing we really need to bind us together is a growing economy. And that as long as the stock market is going up and the economy is moving forward, then why do we need a common story, or why do we need a common creed?
Well, I think it's the version of Melody's question. And I'll just repeat, I think a healthy economy is maybe a necessary element, but it is surely not a sufficient one.
Yeah, I would just add, I had this experience as a kid. I grew up on Drake Road in Cincinnati, Ohio, and 3 doors down was this extremely humble, reclusive man named Neil Armstrong. And, he comes back from landing on the moon, and he's totally overwhelmed by the public attention and sort of turns it over to Buzz Aldrin to be the NASA spokesperson. But he used to come for dinner because he was a friend of my dad's. And he would tell us a story about how, this young president went to the well of the house, and without having any idea how to get to the moon, John Kennedy says, "We will send a man to the moon and return him safely to Earth within a decade." And it inspired 400,000 engineers in the United States and around the world to innovate and collaborate to make that happen. And so the world has these sustainable development goals. I don't know why America doesn't have like 10 opportunity millennium goals and unleashes the innovation, entrepreneurial spirit of the American people. We have all this attention focused on public officials and the twittering and the infighting. I don't know why we're not unleashing more of the energy of people who could really take a very concrete goal. It doesn't have to be going to the moon, but something concrete, ending hunger, homelessness, 95% graduation rates, college attainment. You could think of a whole host of goals that the country, if it worked together across difference, could meet. And then just have our political leaders like Kennedy, their role is to issue the challenge and then let the country innovate. I don't know why we don't have more of that spirit today than we did when I was growing up. And Neil used to talk about it with such, it brought the whole world together, this moment where we were all captured by this dream that we had realized. We could do that again and again and again on a whole host of issues, I think.
Ask what you can do for your country.
Yeah.
You haven't heard that kind of a summons in a long time.
Right, and Kennedy also said when he issued that decree, we don't do it because it's easy, we do it because it is hard.
Yeah.
So it is a question about challenges, and for a class I'm teaching in the spring was just rereading his 60 convention speech, and he said, I'm not coming here with promises, I'm coming here with challenges.
Yeah.
For the nation. And I would also add to your answer to the question that even with the rising stock market, even with unemployment going down, and I would also argue that we measure unemployment in ways that don't encompass the entirety of our population, that we have to ask ourselves the question, who's also not in that number?
Yeah.
Is the opportunity equitably felt? Because that goes to what you were talking about in the film, this aspirational notion of opportunity, that life for me can be better than it was for my father, and my children's life can be better than it was than mine. But if people year after year, generation after generation, feel as though they are stuck on the bottom rungs of that ladder while the rest of the country is moving forward without them, it creates a sense that this is the we in the Constitution is not mine. And I also think about Raj Chetty, who's an economist, and you all probably saw it, if you may remember it, this article in the New York Times with some of his latest research. And it wasn't just research about young people at the lowest rungs of the economic ladder. He was showing what happens to African American boys from middle class and upper class families, and the fact that many of them, excuse me, will not be able to remain with all of the advantages that we're thinking about in those upper rungs. And in fact, you'll see it's a very jarring chart of them dropping down from the 5th and 4th quintiles to the 3rd and 2nd quintiles. So we have to ask ourselves the question, why is this happening? And those are questions that aren't just reflected in the stock market booming and our ability for some of us to do well.
Can I just add one thing to my response to your question? And this is a kind of a contrary-facing data point. Again, it comes from my recent time in China. I had a long 3-hour evening discussion over dinner with a couple of dozen students at Renmin University in Beijing just about 2 weeks ago. And it was quite clear in this discussion that these young students were very proud of their country. They're very confident about its future and their place in it. They're eager to take place in it. And the atmosphere in the room of sense of pride and can-do was the sort of thing we associated with our culture a generation or two back, but is kind of in scarce supply today. But, and this goes to the point of the relationship between prosperity, healthy economy, economic growth, and all these other things. When I asked these students what they thought, the last question of the evening in our discussion, what they thought were the greatest problems facing their generation, China in the future, they consulted amongst themselves a bit, and then they agreed strongly, robust consensus. There were 2 things that really bothered them. And I'll use their language. Their English was quite good. Class stratification and social isolation. So China is in some ways a kind of a laboratory for some of the things we're discussing here. That they've raised 500 million people out of poverty in 2 generations, brought them into the global bourgeoisie, also brought them out of traditional villages in the countryside and put them in cities. And there's a lot of social isolation and a lot of, the Gini index for China is almost the same as the United States. There's a lot of class stratification. So prosperity can cut 2 ways, or economic growth can cut 2 ways.
I think this gentleman here, I don't know if you still have your question? Not putting you on the spot.
Thank you. It's on. All right, great. I think I have seen the film before and then have heard you all speak and find there to be a great deal of richness in the conversation. But I find myself a bit befuddled as to what the American creed is. And I wonder if each of you, in a very succinct way, might say what you mean when you say American creed or the American creed, something like that. What are we talking about here?
I can be fairly concrete about that, although you're right, it's a kind of a gauzy concept. But when we were working on the film, our touchstone was the title. It came from a famous book by Gunnar Myrdal, published during World War II, called An American Dilemma, which was about racial inequality, a very empirically rich examination of the failure of this society to live up to its promise of equality for all people. And in the course of that book, Gunnar Myrdal is the author, a Swedish economist. He posited that every American had internalized a creed. And the creed was very fundamental, very basic. It was the idea that every single person is dignified and is worthy of respect and deserves to live his or her life on a level playing field where there are no obstacles to individual aspiration. And Myrdal posited, this is myth-making maybe, but it's aspirational in a good way. He posited, he says, I'm going to paraphrase this, I can't quote it exactly, but he said something to the effect that every redneck cracker back in the hollows of Appalachia has internalized this creed just like everybody else. It's in all of us if we really examine our conscience and think about what we believe about our fellow human beings in our society. That we believe in the dignity of every individual, and we believe in fair play and opportunity for all. That was the concept we had in mind working on the film.
I would just say I agree with all that, eloquently expressed. There's this guy, John Gardner, who was a real force in American life for many, many years. He summarized it well. I think he said, freedom and responsibility, liberty and duty, that's the deal. I thought that captured it really well. It gets to the dignity of every individual. It gets to the freedom that those young people and leaders talked about, but it also gets to the flip side that this young man raised, which is with that freedom comes enormous responsibility, and to live out, this mystical notion of the pursuit of happiness. There's this little book I read that Mortimer Adler called "We Hold These Truths," and it basically it was designed in the bicentennial of the celebration of the country to acquaint young people with the ideas and ideals of the Constitution, and to actually not only explain America's creed in all its majesty, but then to connect it to real problems in American democracy so that young people could be experiencing things in their schools and their communities that actually brought the Bill of Rights or what was stated in the Constitution or the Declaration to life in their own lives. When I was in 8th grade, I had to defend Dred Scott in that horrible decision by Justice Taney saying that he wasn't even a citizen, didn't have standing before the Supreme Court, so the whole thing was obiter dictum. And I remember everything about it because I had an experience that brought the life, the Constitution to life, and then I was the lawyer representing Dred Scott. The pressure was on. And I don't feel like we have enough experiences like that to actually, and I like Eric's, the oath is great, but think about what do we really do in daily life or in our schools that brings America's creed, an understanding of the creed to life, and I feel like we need massive civic education and experiences that would do that.
And we teach civics less and less frequently than we used to.
Yeah. Right. And I will associate myself with the remarks of my colleagues, as we used to say when I worked in the Congress. But going to what David was saying, in terms of the respect for all, the need to move beyond a hierarchy of human value is one that I think we have to dedicate ourselves to. I have seen a lot of research, and if we are honest with ourselves, it is, as women in the back said, how do we run toward each other as opposed to away from each other? As James Baldwin wrote, "For they are all our children, we will profit for or pay for what they become." So how do we move towards that? It is unfinished business in our country. And then I would also add the issues of equity, which is, I think, the second part of what you were referring to, this level playing field. But how do we ensure that people in the American experience, that they can live to their potential? And then we get the unleashing of the vast power of this country when everyone gets to participate and to their ability. So I believe that that is our creed. It is aspirational, but that's what we have to work toward. And that is the business that I think so many of us are collectively, hopefully in. It is, I see one hand. I'll take one last question, and because I've got 2 minutes before I have to close.
I just want to say, the stock market may be booming. That's all well and good for all of us. But what about the people who don't even make a living wage? And there's an awful lot of them, an awful lot. We're the 1%, they're the 99%. And that's a pretty bad odds, for civil unrest. I mean, something has to be done that people are paid a living wage. It's a disgrace.
Well, I live in and vote in, work in the richest state in the country, California. If it were an independent country, it'd be the 6th largest economy in the world. And we have a 20% poverty rate in the richest state in the United States. And the highest poverty rate in the United States.
And there are places where unemployment is not under 4%, it's 40%. So we, to your point, and I think we were speaking to some of that earlier, those are the challenges that face our country. Well, with that, please join me in thanking both David and John Bergman. Thank you.
This was fun. Really enjoyed getting to know you.